For 132 years, the United States government had no detectives. Think about that for a moment. From the Declaration of Independence in 1776 until the summer of 1908, the most ambitious republic in the world, a nation that fought a civil war, built a transcontinental railroad, absorbed tens of millions of immigrants, and grew into an industrial giant, had no federal agency whose job was to investigate crime, no FBI, no federal detectives, no national police force of any kind. If a criminal robbed a bank in Missouri and rode across the state line into Kansas, no federal officer chased him. If a con man defrauded investors in 3 different states, no national bureau opened a file on him. If someone plotted to assassinate the President of the United States, there was no agency assigned to stop him. And presidents were assassinated. 3 of them in a span of just 36 years. We assume the FBI has always existed, the way we assume roads and courts and post offices have always existed. It feels like part of the permanent furniture of American life. But it is not. The FBI is younger than the light bulb, younger than the telephone, younger than Coca-Cola. There are photographs of New York City skyscrapers that are older than the FBI. So this raises questions that almost nobody thinks to ask. Who hunted criminals before 1908? When a murderer crossed state lines, who followed? When counterfeiters flooded the country with fake money, and at one point, nearly half the paper currency in circulation may have been fake, who stopped them? When trains were robbed, banks were emptied, and entire territories became havens for outlaws, who brought order? And here is the stranger question. If America survived for more than a century without a national detective force, why did it suddenly need one in 1908? What changed? What broke? The answer involves a president with a grudge, an attorney general who happened to be the grandnephew of Napoleon Bonaparte, Congress terrified of secret police, a scandal that reached into the United States Senate itself, and a quiet bureaucratic maneuver, executed while Congress was out of town, that lawmakers would later call an act of defiance. Because here is what the textbooks rarely mention. The FBI was not created by a law. Congress never voted to establish it. In fact, Congress had just voted to prevent something very much like it from existing. The most powerful law enforcement agency in American history was born from a loophole in the dead of summer, without ceremony, without legislation, and very nearly without anyone noticing. To understand why that happened, and why it matters more than ever, we have to go back to the beginning. Back to a country that believed, with almost religious conviction, that a national police force was the single most dangerous thing a free government could possess. To understand American law enforcement before the FBI, you have to first understand a fear. The men who wrote the Constitution had studied history obsessively, and history had taught them a lesson they never forgot. Standing armies and centralized police were the tools of tyrants. They had watched British soldiers enforce unpopular laws in colonial streets. They knew how European monarchs used spies, informants, and royal officers to crush dissent. In France, and later under Napoleon, the police ministry run by Joseph Fouché became a byword for surveillance. A state that watched its own citizens, opened their letters, and filled its prisons with people who had committed no crime except speaking. So when Americans built their republic, they made a deliberate choice. Policing would stay local. Crime would be handled by the community where it happened. The federal government would remain small, distant, and, by design, nearly blind. For most Americans in 1800, the entire apparatus of law enforcement consisted of 3 figures: the sheriff, the constable, and the night watchman. The sheriff was an inheritance from England, an office nearly 1,000 years old. In America, he was usually elected, which made him something unusual in world history, a law enforcement officer who answered directly to the people he policed. He served warrants, ran the county jail, collected taxes, and organized responses to crime. But here is what surprises modern audiences. The sheriff rarely went looking for criminals. He was reactive, not investigative. If a crime happened, the victim often had to drive the process themselves. Identifying the suspect, gathering witnesses, sometimes even paying fees to have an arrest made, that is worth pausing on. In early America, criminal investigation was largely a private matter. If your horse was stolen, you organized the search. You offered the reward. You hired the help. Justice was something you pursued, sometimes literally, on horseback. And when a crime was serious enough, the sheriff had one great power, the posse comitatus. The phrase is Latin, meaning the power of the county. It meant the sheriff could legally summon every able-bodied man in the area to drop what he was doing, grab a weapon, and join the hunt. Refusing was a crime. The posse was not a movie invention. It was the backbone of American law enforcement for a century. When you had no detectives, no radios, and no forensics, what you had instead was numbers. A wall of armed neighbors between a fugitive and the horizon. In the cities, order at night belonged to the watch. Boston organized a night watch as early as 1636. New York had one under the Dutch. Watchmen walked the streets with lanterns, calling out the hours, looking for fires as much as criminals. They were, by nearly every historical account, spectacularly ineffective. Watch duty was unpaid or poorly paid, and it was often assigned as a civic obligation or even a punishment. Men slept through their shifts. Some showed up drunk. Criminals learned the watchman's routes and simply worked around them. It took shocking levels of urban disorder to change this. Boston established a formal day police force in 1838. New York followed in 1845, creating a unified police department modeled loosely on London's Metropolitan Police, which Robert Peel had founded in 1829. Even then, Americans were suspicious. Early New York officers resisted wearing uniforms because uniforms reminded people of standing armies. They eventually accepted copper badges, which is one popular explanation for the nickname that still survives, cops. But notice what all of this was: local, municipal, county level. The moment a criminal crossed a jurisdictional line, the system's power evaporated. A Massachusetts constable had no authority in New York. An Ohio sheriff could not make an arrest in Kentucky. America was not one law enforcement jurisdiction. It was thousands of them, stitched loosely together, each one ending at an invisible line on a map. Criminals figured this out almost immediately, and where the official system failed, Americans improvised, sometimes admirably, often disturbingly. Consider how a crime was actually solved in this world. There were no detectives to assign, so the engine of justice was money. Victims, insurance companies, banks, and governments posted rewards, and the rewards summoned hunters. A whole informal economy of thief-takers, bounty men, and part-time manhunters grew up around the practice. It worked after a fashion, and it created exactly the incentives you would expect. A reward system pays for bodies delivered, not for truth discovered. The line between bounty hunter and kidnapper, between informant and accomplice, was never as clear as anyone pretended. When people today assume that policing has always meant a salaried public professional investigating on behalf of society, they are describing an invention barely older than their great-grandparents. Then there was the darker improvisation. When communities decided the law was too slow, they simply became it. In Gold Rush San Francisco, merchants twice organized themselves into a committee of vigilance. In 1851 and again in 1856, complete with membership rolls in the thousands, their own tribunals, and their own gallows. They hanged men, seized prisoners from lawful custody, and effectively suspended the elected government of the city, all to public applause. The vigilance tradition spread through the mining camps and cattle country of the West, where formal courts might be weeks away. Some of these committees genuinely confronted organized criminal gangs. Others became indistinguishable from the mobs they claimed to replace. The lesson stamped into American history was double-edged. A society without adequate public law enforcement does not get less enforcement. It gets enforcement without rules. And in the South, the oldest organized patrols in America served a purpose that must be named plainly. From the early 1700s, slave patrols, mounted, armed, and required by law in many colonies and states, policed the enslaved population, hunting people who fled bondage and breaking up gatherings. They were, by the assessment of many historians, among the most developed policing institutions in early America, and their existence is a permanent reminder that the question who does the law protect has never had a single answer in this country. After the Civil War, the machinery and mentality of the patrols did not simply vanish. Scholars have traced their echoes through Reconstruction-era enforcement and beyond. A few states built something more durable. Texas maintained ranging companies from the 1820s onward, the ancestors of the Texas Rangers, a mounted force that blurred the line between soldiers, border guards, and lawmen, and whose long record contains celebrated manhunts and, historians now document, grave abuses along the border. But the Rangers were the exception that proved the rule. They were a state force, for one enormous state with unusual problems. No one proposed anything like them for the nation, and yet the federal government was not entirely absent. It had a handful of officers, scattered and specialized, and their stories are some of the most overlooked in American history. The first were the United States Marshals. When Congress passed the Judiciary Act of 1789, creating the federal court system, it also created marshals to serve those courts, one for each judicial district, appointed by the president. George Washington personally selected the first 13. On paper, their job was narrow: serve warrants, transport prisoners, protect judges, handle the paperwork of federal justice. They even conducted the national census for decades, riding door-to-door counting Americans. But in practice, the marshals became something more. They were, for over a century, the only face of federal authority most Americans would ever see. When federal law needed enforcing in places where no other authority existed, and in the expanding West, that was nearly everywhere, the job fell to the marshals and their deputies. Their history began almost immediately and dramatically. In 1794, when farmers in western Pennsylvania rose against the new federal whiskey tax, it was a U.S. Marshal, David Lennox, serving court papers on distillers, who became the spark for open rebellion. And it took President Washington, personally leading an army of militia over the mountains, to restore federal authority. The message of the Whiskey Rebellion lingered for a century. The federal government could, in an emergency, enforce its will with overwhelming force. What it could not do was enforce it routinely, quietly, professionally, every ordinary day. It had an army for rebellions. It had almost nothing for crime. The marshals also carried out the most morally corrosive duty ever assigned to American law enforcement. Under the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, federal marshals were legally required to pursue and return people who had escaped slavery, and could be fined for refusing, could summon bystanders to assist. In cities like Boston, marshals enforcing that law needed troops to hold back crowds attempting rescues. The return of Anthony Burns to bondage in 1854 required a military escort through streets draped in mourning black at staggering government expense. It is a chapter worth remembering whenever this story tempts us towards simple nostalgia. Federal law enforcement, in the era before the FBI, was only ever as just as the laws it served, and some of those laws were monstrous. The machinery does not supply the morality. It never has. The scale of what they faced is difficult to exaggerate. Consider the Indian Territory, in what is now Oklahoma. In the late 19th century, it became one of the most dangerous places in America, a jurisdictional twilight zone where outlaws fled because state law could not reach them. The federal court at Fort Smith, Arkansas, under Judge Isaac Parker, held jurisdiction over that vast territory, and the deputy marshals who rode out of Fort Smith did so knowing the odds. Over the course of Parker's tenure, dozens of deputy marshals were killed in the line of duty. They were paid in fees, so much per arrest, so much per mile traveled, which meant a deputy could ride hundreds of miles, risk his life, and come home nearly broke. One of those deputies deserves a moment of his own. Bass Reeves was born enslaved in Arkansas. He escaped bondage during the Civil War, lived among the Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole nations, and learned the territory and its languages. In 1875, he was commissioned as a deputy U.S. Marshal, one of the first black deputy marshals west of the Mississippi. Over a career spanning 3 decades, Reeves is credited with arresting more than 3,000 fugitives. He was a master of disguise, an expert marksman, and by the accounts that survive, incorruptible. At one point, he arrested his own son on a murder warrant, because the law was the law. Bass Reeves policed a territory the size of a European country, largely alone, in an era when the federal government he served would not have let him vote in much of it. That was federal law enforcement in the 19th century. Not an agency, not a bureau. A scattering of remarkable, underpaid individuals holding a line that stretched across a continent, but the marshals were court officers, not detectives. They executed warrants, they did not build cases. And as America industrialized, a new kind of crime emerged, organized, mobile, financial interstate that no sheriff, no watchman, and no marshal was equipped to investigate. Into that vacuum stepped something the founders never anticipated, a private corporation. His name was Allan Pinkerton, and before he became the most famous detective in the world, he was a barrel maker. Pinkerton was born in Glasgow, Scotland in 1819, the son of a policeman's family fallen on hard times. As a young man, he became a Chartist, a member of a radical movement demanding voting rights for working men, and when that activism made Scotland dangerous for him, he emigrated. He settled outside Chicago and set up shop as a cooper, making barrels. The story of how he became a detective sounds like fiction, but it is well documented in its outlines. In the late 1840s, while cutting wood on a small island in the Fox River, Pinkerton stumbled across the campsite of a gang of counterfeiters. Instead of walking away, he watched them, returned with the local sheriff, and helped capture the gang. The episode made him a local celebrity, and it revealed a talent. He became a deputy sheriff, then Chicago's first police detective, and around 1850 he founded his own private agency. The Pinkerton National Detective Agency chose as its emblem a wide open eye, above the motto, "We never sleep." That unblinking eye is one origin often cited for a phrase that entered the language, the private eye. And here is the fact that reframes everything about this era. For roughly half a century, the Pinkerton Agency functioned as the closest thing America had to a national investigative force. Not the government, a business. At its height, the agency's ranks of agents and reserves outnumbered the standing army of the United States. Let that settle for a moment. The largest organized investigative force in America answered not to voters or courts, but to paying clients. The Pinkertons built what no government office possessed, a criminal database. They collected photographs of known criminals, their so-called rogues gallery, along with physical descriptions, known associates, and methods of operation. Long before any federal fingerprint file existed, the Pinkertons were doing something recognizable as modern criminal intelligence. Police departments across the country wrote to them for information because there was no one else to ask. Their client list tells you who actually needed interstate law enforcement: railroads, express companies, and banks. The industries whose money moved across state lines were the ones who paid to protect it. Because no public institution could, in 1861, the agency stepped into national history. While investigating threats against a railroad, Pinkerton's operatives, including Kate Warren, whom Pinkerton had hired in 1856 as one of the first female detectives in America, uncovered what they believed was a plot to assassinate President-elect Abraham Lincoln as he changed trains in Baltimore on the way to his inauguration. Historians still debate how developed the Baltimore plot truly was. But Pinkerton took it seriously, and so did Lincoln's advisors. The president-elect was moved through Baltimore secretly, at night, ahead of his published schedule, with Warren playing a role in the deception. Lincoln arrived in Washington safely, and was mocked in the press for sneaking into the Capitol. During the war that followed, Pinkerton ran intelligence operations for General George McClellan, though his wildly inflated estimates of Confederate troop strength arguably did the Union more harm than good. After the war, the Pinkertons turned to the crime wave sweeping the industrializing nation, and their story darkens. They pursued the era's most famous outlaws, the Reno Gang, who essentially invented peacetime train robbery in the 1860s, and later the James Younger Gang. The hunt for Jesse James produced one of the agency's worst stains. In January 1875, operatives surrounded the Missouri farmhouse of James's mother and threw an incendiary device inside. The explosion killed Jesse's young half-brother, Archie, and tore off part of his mother's arm. Jesse James was not there. Public opinion in Missouri, already sympathetic to James as a kind of folk avenger, turned violently against the Pinkertons. The episode revealed the fundamental problem with private law enforcement. A corporation pursuing a fugitive answers to no constitution, no court, and no voter. That problem exploded into national politics through the labor wars. As industrial conflict intensified in the 1870s and 1880s, corporations discovered a new use for detective agencies, infiltrating and breaking unions. A Pinkerton operative named James McParland spent years undercover inside the Molly McGears, a secret society of Irish miners in Pennsylvania's anthracite country, accused of violence against mine bosses. His testimony sent 20 men to the gallows. Historians still argue about how much of the Molly Maguire violence was real, how much was exaggerated, and how much was entrapment. The trials were run largely by the coal company's own lawyers, a fact that shocks modern legal sensibilities. Then came Homestead. In July 1892, during a lockout at Andrew Carnegie's steelworks in Homestead, Pennsylvania, the company brought in some 300 armed Pinkerton agents on barges up the Monongahela River. The workers were waiting. A day-long gun battle followed, leaving dead on both sides, and the surrendered Pinkertons were marched through a gauntlet of furious townspeople. The spectacle, a private army hired by a corporation, fighting American workers on American soil, horrified the country. Congress responded in 1893 with the Anti-Pinkerton Act, which barred the federal government from hiring the agency's employees or similar organizations. Think about what that means for our story. The United States government's first major legislation about detective forces was not to create one. It was to ban itself from renting one. So by the 1890s, America had reached a strange impasse. The public had seen what private national policing looked like and recoiled, but it still refused on principle to build a public alternative. The old fear of federal police remained as strong as ever. Meanwhile, quietly, inside the federal government itself, a few small forces were already proving that federal investigation could work. And one of them was born in the final hours of Abraham Lincoln's life. On the afternoon of April 14, 1865, Abraham Lincoln met with his Treasury Secretary, Hugh McCulloch, and discussed a problem that was quietly strangling the American economy. Counterfeit money. To understand the scale of it, you need to picture the currency of that era. Before the Civil War, there was no single national paper currency. State-chartered banks issued their own notes, thousands of different designs, from hundreds of different banks in every denomination. Merchants kept reference books just to tell which notes were real, which were fake, and which came from banks that had already collapsed. Into that chaos, counterfeiters poured an ocean of forged paper. Estimates from the period suggest that by the war's end, as much as one-third of the currency in circulation, some contemporary claims ran even higher, was counterfeit. That is not a crime problem. That is an existential threat. A currency that cannot be trusted is barely a currency at all. The new national greenbacks issued during the war were supposed to fix the chaos, but they simply gave counterfeiters a single, standardized target. So on that April afternoon, Lincoln approved the creation of a small treasury force dedicated to hunting counterfeiters. That evening he went to Ford's Theater. The bitter irony has been noted by nearly every historian who tells this story. On the day of his assassination, Lincoln helped set in motion the agency that would one day guard presidents, though protecting presidents was nowhere in its original mission. The United States Secret Service was formally established on July 5, 1865, as a division of the Treasury Department with one job: protect the money. Its first chief, William P. Wood, was a hard man for a hard task, a former prison keeper with a reputation for methods that bent every rule that existed and several that did not. But the service worked. Its operatives infiltrated counterfeiting rings, seized engraving plates, and over the following decades drove counterfeit currency from a national plague down to a manageable nuisance. It was the proof of concept nobody wanted to acknowledge. A small professional federal detective force could actually function without ushering in tyranny. And because it was the only such force in existence, the Secret Service became the federal government's odd-job detective squad. When other departments needed investigators, they borrowed Secret Service men. Over the years, operatives on loan investigated land frauds, smuggling rings, and violations across the government. After President William McKinley was shot in Buffalo in 1901, the third president murdered in 36 years, after Lincoln in 1865 and Garfield in 1881, the service informally took on presidential protection as well. Because once again, there was simply no one else. One episode from those early years shows just how strange the counterfeiting wars became. In 1876, a Chicago counterfeiting ring faced a crisis. Their master engraver, Benjamin Boyd, was in prison, and without his plates, the operation was dying. Their solution was among the most bizarre criminal plots in American history. They would break into the tomb of Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois, steal the president's body, hide it, and ransom it back to the government for $200,000 and Boyd's release. The Secret Service learned of the plan through an informant planted inside the gang, and on election night 1876, as the thieves pried open Lincoln's sarcophagus, operatives were waiting in the darkness of the memorial. The arrest descended into confusion. A nervous agent's pistol went off early and the robbers fled, though they were captured days later, and the two men were convicted of the only crime that fit, essentially conspiracy and attempted theft of a coffin, because stealing a president's body was not clearly illegal in Illinois. The state wrote a body-snatching law afterward. Lincoln's remains were eventually secured beneath tons of concrete. The story sounds invented. It is documented in court records and the memoirs of the men who were there. It also makes the point better than any statistic. In the 1870s, the federal government's entire national detective capacity amounted to a small band of Treasury operatives who spent one night guarding a dead president because there was no one else to do it. The Secret Service was not the only quiet pioneer. The oldest federal investigative tradition in America actually belongs to the mail. Benjamin Franklin, as colonial postmaster, appointed surveyors to audit and inspect postal routes as early as the 1770s. That role evolved into the postal inspectors, officers with the authority to investigate crimes involving the mail. And in 19th century America, an astonishing amount of crime involved the mail, because the mail was how money moved. Stagecoach robbers, train robbers, post office burglars, and eventually a whole new species of criminal, the mail fraud con artists selling fake gold mines and miracle cures to victims across state lines, all fell within the postal inspector's reach. Congress passed the mail fraud statute in 1872, and it became one of the most powerful anti-fraud weapons in American law. It still is. When federal prosecutors today take down a Ponzi scheme, the charge sheet very often still begins with mail fraud or its younger cousin, wire fraud. Add the customs officers policing the ports and the revenue agents chasing untaxed whiskey through the mountains, and you can see the true shape of federal law enforcement before 1908. It was not absent. It was fragmented, a handful of specialized forces, each guarding one narrow function of government: the money, the mail, the borders, the taxes. But notice the enormous hole in the middle. General crimes against federal law, fraud against the government, corruption, peonage, antitrust violations, crimes on federal land, belonged to the Department of Justice. And the Department of Justice, the government's own law firm, created in 1870, had prosecutors but no investigators. None. It was a courtroom without a police force. When the DOJ needed facts gathered, it hired private detectives, until the Anti-Pinkerton Act closed that door. Or it went hat in hand to the Treasury and borrowed Secret Service operatives at a daily rate. Sit with the absurdity of that arrangement. The nation's chief law enforcement department could not enforce the law without renting detectives from the tax collectors. For decades, this embarrassment survived because the workload was light. Then America changed, and the arrangement began to buckle. The country that entered the 20th century was unrecognizable from the one that had written the rules. In 1800, the United States was a coastal republic of farmers, 5 million people, 4 out of 5 of them working the land. By 1900, it was a continental industrial colossus of 76 million, laced together by nearly 200,000 miles of railroad track. A person could board a train in New York and step off in San Francisco in under a week. A telegram crossed the continent in minutes. Every one of those innovations was also a gift to criminals. The railroad did not just move passengers, it moved fugitives. A bank robber in one state could be 3 jurisdictions away before the local sheriff finished assembling his posse. Corporations now operated across dozens of states, which meant corporate fraud did too. Stock swindles, insurance frauds, land schemes. The crimes of the new economy were built to exploit the gaps between jurisdictions, and the gaps were everywhere. And a new kind of criminal was emerging, one who never carried a gun. He carried a ledger. The Gilded Age had produced concentrations of wealth and corporate power beyond anything the founders imagined. Railroads bribed legislatures. Trusts strangled competition. Land companies looted the public domain. In the South, a system of peonage, debt slavery in all but name, held black workers in forced labor decades after the 13th Amendment, and federal prosecutors trying to break it had almost no investigators to build cases with. The public mood was shifting too. This was the progressive era, the age of the muckrakers. Journalists like Ida Tarbell dissecting Standard Oil and Lincoln Steffens mapping the corruption of city governments. Americans were discovering, in their morning newspapers, that the real threats to the Republic might not be street criminals at all, but respectable men in respectable offices. The violence of the new century sharpened the fear. In September 1901, President William McKinley stood in a receiving line at the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, shaking hands with the public, when a young man named Leon Czolgosz reached him with a revolver concealed under a handkerchief. Czolgosz called himself an anarchist, part of a movement that had already claimed the lives of a French president, a Spanish prime minister, an Austrian empress, and an Italian king in the space of a decade. McKinley died 8 days later, and when officials asked the obvious question, which federal agency tracks violent anarchists in the United States, the answer was the same answer as always: none. There was no federal capacity to investigate political violence, because there was no federal capacity to investigate anything. The Secret Service had men near McKinley that day, but presidential protection was still an improvised sideline of a counterfeiting squad. The most powerful office in the nation was guarded by an agency whose legal mission was paper money. The man that Bullitt elevated to the presidency would change everything. There was also quieter violence that the federal government could barely see, let alone stop. Across parts of the Deep South, investigators and journalists in the early 1900s documented peonage, a system in which black men were arrested on trivial or invented charges, assessed fines they could not pay, and then leased or bound to planters, mine operators, and turpentine camps to work off the debt under armed guard. It was forced labor operating in the open, 4 decades after emancipation. Federal law prohibited it. Federal prosecutors, in scattered courageous cases, attacked it. But building a peonage case meant sending investigators into hostile counties, finding terrified witnesses, documenting a conspiracy of local officials and employers, precisely the sustained investigative work the Justice Department had no staff to perform. Some of the earliest files the new Bureau of Investigation would open after 1908 were peonage files. It is one of the forgotten origins of the FBI. Among its first assignments was investigating slavery in 20th century America. Into this moment strode a president who took corruption personally. Theodore Roosevelt did not enter the White House as a stranger to policing. He had served as a civil service commissioner fighting patronage and as president of New York City's police board, where he prowled the streets at night, catching officers asleep on duty. He believed in what he called the strenuous enforcement of the law against rich and poor alike, and he was temperamentally incapable of accepting that the federal government should remain weak while the crimes in front of it grew strong, and the crimes in front of him were remarkable. Consider the scandal that, more than any other single affair, set our story in motion: the great Western land frauds. For decades, federal land laws had been designed to hand the public domain to small settlers, homesteads, timber claims, modest parcels for ordinary families. And for decades, syndicates had gamed those laws on an industrial scale, hiring fake claimants to file for land and then quietly consolidating vast tracts of timber and grazing country into corporate hands. In Oregon, the fraud reached spectacular proportions, and when federal investigators finally pulled the thread, with Secret Service operatives and the famous detective William J. Burns doing much of the digging, the trail led to shocking places. Dozens of people were indicted. Among those convicted was a sitting United States Senator from Oregon, John H. Mitchell, in 1905. A congressman was caught in the net as well. Roosevelt's administration had done something almost unprecedented. It had investigated Congress itself. Federal detectives, borrowed from the Treasury, had helped send a senator toward prison. Members of Congress noticed. Many of them drew a conclusion that had less to do with principle than with self-preservation. The detectives had to be reined in, while the politics simmered. Something else was changing that made a national bureau not just possible, but almost technically necessary: the science of knowing who a criminal was. For most of the 19th century, identifying a repeat offender depended on memory, a policeman recognizing a face, a jailer recalling a name. Criminals defeated the system by the simple expedient of lying. Then came the first great identification technology, imported from France, the Bertillon system, which recorded a precise set of body measurements, skull dimensions, arm span, finger lengths, on the theory that no two people shared the same combination. American prisons and police departments adopted it enthusiastically. Then, in 1903, at Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary in Kansas, the system met a problem it could not survive. A new prisoner named Will West was measured and photographed, and the clerk insisted he was already in the files. He was not. The records belonged to another man, named William West, already serving time in the same prison, with nearly identical Bertillon measurements and a face so similar the photographs looked like duplicates. By the account that circulated through American law enforcement, the two men were distinguished definitively by only one thing: their fingerprints. The story became the founding legend of American fingerprinting, and whatever embellishments it gathered in the retelling, the underlying shift was real. Within a few years, fingerprint files were replacing measurement cards across the country, but fingerprints created a new problem that pointed in only one direction. A fingerprint file is only as powerful as it is complete. 1,000 separate local collections, uncoordinated, were barely better than none. The burglar printed in Cleveland was a stranger in Cincinnati. The technology of identification was by its very nature national. Somebody, eventually, would have to keep the nation's files. The only question was who. Decades later, the answer would become one of the FBI's foundations: a central identification division whose fingerprint collection grew into the largest in the world. The seed of that empire of records was planted in these years, in the mundane discovery that crime control had become an information problem, and information problems demand centralization. The congressmen who feared a federal bureau were in a sense fighting arithmetic. The man standing at the center of what happened next carried one of the most famous surnames in world history, and he carried it into one of history's stranger ironies. Charles Joseph Bonaparte was the grandnephew of Napoleon Bonaparte. His grandfather, Jerome Bonaparte, Napoleon's youngest brother, had married an American heiress from Baltimore, Elizabeth Patterson, during a visit to the United States. Napoleon, furious at the unsanctioned marriage, had it annulled in France, but the American branch of the family endured. Charles was born in Baltimore in 1851, wealthy, brilliant, and by every account almost aggressively upright. He graduated from Harvard Law, built a reputation as a reformer, helped found the National Municipal League, and earned a nickname that tells you everything about how his fellow patricians viewed him: the Peacock of Reform. He was a founder's generation aristocrat who spent his career attacking machine politics, patronage, and corruption. His personal habits made him something of a Washington curiosity. Here was a man with an emperor's blood and a considerable fortune who famously distrusted modern conveniences and luxuries, a devout Catholic reformer who once quipped about his enthusiasm for rooting out corruption in language so vivid the newspapers loved him. His enemies in machine politics found him insufferable precisely because he could not be bought, frightened, or embarrassed. When he later faced hostile congressional questioning about his new detective force, one exchange captured the man. Pressed on the dangers of government spies, Bonaparte replied that he had no more desire for a spy system than his questioners did, and then calmly explained why a law department without investigators was an absurdity no serious government could tolerate. He conceded the danger and insisted on the necessity in the same breath. It was, whatever else, honest Roosevelt collected men like this. He made Bonaparte Secretary of the Navy in 1905, and in December 1906, Attorney General of the United States. Bonaparte inherited the Justice Department's chronic humiliation, a law department that could not investigate. He inherited the awkward Treasury arrangement, the rented Secret Service operatives, the case files that depended on another department's staff and another department's goodwill, and in 1907 he said so publicly. In his annual report to Congress, he pointed out the obvious, that the Department of Justice had no permanent detective force under its own control, and that a department charged with enforcing federal law ought, as a matter of elementary logic, to have the means of doing so. Congress heard him, and Congress did precisely the opposite. In the spring of 1908, the House took up the Justice Department's appropriations, and the resentment that had been simmering since the land fraud convictions boiled over. Congressmen rose to denounce the use of Secret Service operatives across the government as the seed of a European-style spy system. They invoked the historical nightmares every American schoolboy knew: the general warrants of the British Crown, the police spies of Russia, and, with unavoidable irony given the Attorney General's name, the surveillance state of Napoleonic France, where Joseph Fouche's ministry had made every citizen a potential file. One congressman warned of a system where no man's home was safe from the government's hired eyes. The speeches were thunderous, principled, and, as more than one historian has dryly observed, remarkably well-timed, coming so soon after federal detectives had walked members of Congress into criminal court. In May 1908, Congress attached a rider to the appropriations bill. It barred the Treasury's Secret Service operatives from being loaned out to other departments. The Law Department of the United States was now formally forbidden from borrowing the only detectives the government had. Congress believed it had killed the idea of a federal detective bureau in its crib. It had done the opposite. It had made one inevitable. Here is where the story slows down, because what happened next happened quietly, and the quiet was the point. Picture Washington in the summer of 1908. Congress adjourned at the end of May and scattered home for the season, as it always did before air conditioning made the capital's swamp heat survivable. The appropriations rider was law. The Secret Service loans would end with the fiscal year on June 30. The Department of Justice was about to become on paper blind. Bonaparte read the new law carefully. He noticed what it did not say. Congress had forbidden him from borrowing Treasury detectives. It had not forbidden him from having detectives. In fact, buried in the Justice Department's own appropriation was a general fund for the detection and prosecution of crimes. If borrowed investigators were banned, the logical, one might even say unavoidable, alternative was for the department to employ investigators of its own. Congress, in trying to take detectives away from the Attorney General, had handed him the argument for hiring his own. Whether this was a loophole, a provocation, or simply sound administration depends on which historian you ask, and they have been arguing about it for a century. What is documented is what Bonaparte did. In late June 1908, with Roosevelt's approval, he quietly began assembling a small permanent investigative force inside the Department of Justice. Several former Secret Service men were hired outright, joined by the department's existing bank examiners and a handful of others. A few dozen agents in all, on the order of 30-some men. On June 29, he authorized the hiring, and on July 26, 1908, he issued the order directing that the department's investigations be handled by this new force of special agents, reporting to the chief examiner, a lawyer named Stanley W. Finch. That date, July 26, 1908, is the birthday the FBI itself recognizes today. There was no signing ceremony, no legislation, no name even. Contemporary paperwork referred to it simply as a special agent force. The most consequential law enforcement agency in American history entered the world as an unnamed line item, created by executive order of an attorney general during a congressional recess, in direct defiance of what Congress had just intended. When Congress returned in the winter and discovered what Bonaparte had done, the reaction was everything you would expect. Members accused him of evading the will of the legislature. The old speeches about secret police were dusted off. Bonaparte was summoned to explain himself, and his answers are a study in bureaucratic composure. The department needed investigators, he argued. Congress itself had cut off the alternative. His new force was small, answerable to the Attorney General, and confined to investigating actual violations of federal law. He personally opposed, he said, anything resembling a system of espionage. He asked Congress to place the force on a proper statutory footing, with clear limits so that it would remain accountable. Congress never passed that statute. Instead, it did something quieter and more revealing. It funded the force. Whatever lawmakers said on the floor, they understood that the government had crossed a threshold it could not uncross. A modern state, policing a modern economy, could not function as a courtroom without eyes. In March 1909, the new Attorney General under President Taft, George Wickersham, gave the nameless force a name at last, the Bureau of Investigation. Bonaparte left office with the Roosevelt administration and returned to Baltimore, where he practiced law until his death in 1921. He never sought credit for what he had built, and for most of a century he remained a footnote, the Napoleon who founded the FBI, remembered mostly as a piece of historical trivia. But the debate he stood at the center of in 1908, can a free republic safely possess a federal detective force, and who watches it, never went away. It simply changed names. The bureau that Bonaparte left behind was tiny, and for a moment it seemed it might stay that way. Its first years were spent on unglamorous work, antitrust inquiries, banking violations, land frauds, peonage cases, the crimes on federal reservations. Then, in 1910, Congress handed it the mission that transformed it, and the story of how that happened says a great deal about how power actually grows. The country was in the grip of a moral panic over so-called white slavery, lurid, widely circulated stories of young women lured into forced prostitution by organized rings. Historians looking back have found that the panic wildly exaggerated the reality, but the fear was politically irresistible. In June 1910, Congress passed the Mann Act, making it a federal crime to transport women across state lines for immoral purposes. And here is the crucial mechanism. A federal law about crossing state lines requires federal officers to enforce it. The same Congress that had raged against federal detectives in 1908 now needed them. The Bureau's ranks and budget swelled. Stanley Finch left the top job to lead Mann Act enforcement personally, and a young lawyer administrator named A. Bruce Bielaski took over the Bureau. Notice the pattern, because it will repeat for the next century. A public fear arises. Congress responds with a federal law. The federal law requires federal enforcement. The Bureau grows. Fear, statute, expansion. The engine of the FBI's entire history was assembled in its first 2 years. The First World War supercharged it. Espionage scares, sabotage fears, and the Espionage and Sedition Acts handed the Bureau a counterintelligence mission. And, with it, the temptations Bonaparte had warned about. The Bureau blessed the activities of the American Protective League, a volunteer citizen network, hundreds of thousands strong that spied on neighbors and rounded up suspected draft dodgers in mass slacker raids. Amateur surveillance on a scale the Republic had never seen. After the war came the Red Scare, anarchist bombings, and the Palmer raids of 1919 and 1920, in which thousands of suspected radicals, most of them immigrants, were arrested in sweeping dragnets that courts and later historians would condemn as grave violations of civil liberties. Coordinating the intelligence files for those raids was a young Justice Department official, barely into his 20s, with a gift for indexing information about human beings. His name was J. Edgar Hoover. By the early 1920s, the Bureau had curdled into something close to the nightmare of 1908. Under the scandal-ridden Harding administration, it was used to harass critics of the government, including, in a twist of perfect historical symmetry, members of Congress investigating the Teapot Dome corruption scandal. The Bureau created in defiance of Congress was now spying on Congress. The backlash brought in a reform attorney general, Harlan Fiske Stone, who declared that a secret police system was a menace to free government and institutions. In 1924, Stone appointed the 29-year-old Hoover to clean the Bureau up, on the explicit condition that it stick to investigating actual crimes, stay out of politics, and answer strictly to the Attorney General. Hoover accepted the conditions. He professionalized the agents, built the National Fingerprint Identification Files, founded the crime laboratory, raised hiring standards, and created the modern Bureau's machinery of scientific policing. In 1935, it received the name it carries today, the Federal Bureau of Investigation. And in the gangster era of the 1930s, Dillinger, Pretty Boy Floyd, Machine Gun Kelly, the Lindbergh kidnapping, Hoover's G-men became national heroes, celebrated in films, radio dramas, and comic strips. It is worth pausing on why the 1930s, in particular, turned a modest bureau into a national institution, because the mechanism was the same one that had created it. Technology moved first. The law scrambled after. This time the technology was the automobile. Just as the railroad had once outrun the sheriff's posse, the V8 engine now outran the county line entirely. Bandits like John Dillinger's gang robbed a bank in one state and slept in another. Exploiting the old jurisdictional seams with professional precision, some outlaws reportedly favored particular cars for exactly this work. State police forces, which most states had only recently created, stopped at their borders just as sheriffs always had. The kidnapping and death of Charles Lindbergh's infant son in 1932, the crime of the century, committed against the most famous family in America, crystallized the public demand. Someone must be able to cross every line the criminals crossed. Congress answered with a burst of federal criminal law, the so-called Lindbergh Law making interstate kidnapping a federal crime, followed by statutes covering bank robbery, interstate flight, extortion, and stolen property moving across state lines, along with the first major federal firearms regulation. Each statute was another room added to the house Bonaparte had built without permission. By the end of the decade, the question of 1908, should the federal government have a general detective force, was not merely settled. It was forgotten. Children played G-Man games in the street. The unthinkable had become the unremarkable in a single generation, which is how most permanent expansions of government power actually happen, not through grand constitutional debate, but through emergencies, one at a time, each reasonable on its own terms. He would run the Bureau for 48 years, under 8 presidents, until his death in 1972. And the story of those decades, the genuine achievements against kidnappers, spies, and organized crime, standing alongside the secret files on politicians, the surveillance of civil rights leaders, and the abuses eventually exposed as COINTELPRO, is, in the end, the 1908 debate playing out on a national stage. The congressmen who warned that a federal detective force would one day watch the government itself were dismissed in their own time as self-interested men protecting their friends. They were, in fact, both self-interested and correct. History permits that combination more often than we like to admit. So let's return to the question we started with, because now it looks different. Who hunted criminals before 1908? The honest answer is, almost everyone except the federal government. Elected sheriffs and their posses, underpaid constables and sleeping watchmen. A few hundred scattered U.S. marshals and deputies riding circuit across a continent. Postal inspectors following the money through the mail. Secret Service operatives chasing counterfeiters, then loaned out to plug every other hole in the ship. And filling the largest gap of all, a private corporation whose agents outnumbered the army. A fact that should permanently retire the assumption that American policing grew naturally from some master plan. It grew from improvisation, crisis, and reluctance, in that order. And that reluctance was not foolishness, it was memory. For over a century, Americans looked at national police forces and saw Fouche's spies, the Tsar's informants, the knock on the door at midnight. They preferred inefficiency to danger. They accepted that some criminals would escape across state lines as the price of a government that could not easily watch its own citizens. It was, whatever else you think of it, a coherent choice. And America may be the only major nation whose founding generation made it so deliberately. What finally broke that choice was not an argument, it was infrastructure. Railroads, telegraphs, national corporations, and national markets created national crime, and national crime made local justice look like a picket fence in a flood. The FBI exists at bottom because the economy outgrew the map. Every debate since, over wiretaps, over surveillance powers, over the reach of federal law enforcement into digital life, is a rerun of the same collision between technology that ignores borders and institutions built to respect them. There is one more legacy hiding in this story, and it may be the most important. Because the Bureau was born without a statute, its limits were never really defined at birth. It grew mission by mission, fear by fear, statute by statute, the Mann Act, the war powers, the gangster laws, the security state. Institutions created in ambiguity tend to expand into it. The men of 1908, who demanded that Congress write clear boundaries around the new force before funding it, lost that fight, and American history spent the next 100 years discovering what they had been trying to prevent, one scandal and one reform at a time. Step back far enough, and this stops being a story about detectives at all. It becomes a story about a permanent tension inside every free society, the space between the government we fear and the government we need. The founders built their republic around the fear, and for a century the country lived inside it, accepting disorder, private armies, and escaped criminals as the cost of liberty. The modern era built its institutions around the need, accepting files, surveillance, and concentrated power as the cost of order. Neither generation was wrong about the danger the other accepted. That is what makes the story uncomfortable, and what makes it worth telling, and it turns on such small hinges. A congressman's grudge, a summer recess, a careful lawyer with an emperor's name reading an appropriations bill and noticing what it failed to forbid. No vote was ever taken on whether the United States should have a national investigative police force. It simply, one July day in 1908, began, and the country has been arguing about it ever since, which may be the healthiest thing about the whole affair. The moment a nation stops arguing about who watches the watchman is the moment it should start worrying. The next time you see those 3 letters, on a badge, in a headline, in a film, remember that for most of American history they would have been unthinkable. Remember the sheriffs and the posses, the marshals riding out of Fort Smith, Bass Reeves with 3,000 arrests and no monument for a century, the unsleeping eye of a private agency, and the counterfeit republic that nearly drowned in its own fake money. The FBI did not descend from the founding. It was improvised, resisted, denounced, and then quietly made permanent, like so much of the machinery that actually runs the modern world. If you enjoy uncovering the forgotten systems, people, and decisions that shape the modern world, subscribe for more documentaries like this. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.